I have this alternator, 105 amp alternator. I use it to charge up batteries, and it just stopped working. So I'm going to try and diagnose the problem, and I'm going to start off by taking it apart. And first thing needs to happen is this big nut here needs to come off, and then these pulleys need to come off so it can actually be separated. So I'll be back with you as I proceed ahead with doing these few things. I got this big nut loose. That's a pretty tricky job sometimes, getting this big nut loose. And just when you think you have the nut loose, don't think the pulley's going to come off easy, because that's the next chore, and sometimes it's very, very stubborn getting this pulley off. So I'll be back with you, and I'm going to work at getting this pulley off. Alright, I've got the pulley off. It was no easy job taking off. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret. You don't want to be hitting this with a hammer where the nut comes off of the thread part. You don't want to do that. Mostly they have an indent here. In this case here, for this shaft, it's an Allen key. For this one here, it's this tight. So you see what happens to the socket by beating it with a hammer? Well, if you beat the shaft, that's what's going to happen to the shaft. So you want to use the shaft as your, and you want to use the socket as your beater. Save the shaft so you don't mushroom out the end, so you're still able to get the nut back on to tighten up the pulley back when you're all finished with it. Okay, so the next process will be separating the alternator so I can get to the inside part of it and see what went wrong. So I'll be back with you. Okay, it's separated. Now here's the brush end and the diode end. Now the brushes look good. Now I'm going to test out the diodes, and I'm going to look for small pieces of corrosion and pieces of maybe where it might have disconnected internally. Now I noticed that on the commutator, which is a very important place, you want to always look here. It's extremely dirty. Now I think that's the problem I'm having, is just the dirt there. So I think really all I'm going to have to do is clean up the commutator along with the brushes, and I think we're going to be back okay again. But being that it's all apart, I'm going to test out the diodes in here. And there's 3 diodes, and the brushes look really, really dirty, so I'm definitely going to clean them up. Look like they're full of grease or something. So I'm pretty sure that's what the problem was with this alternator. It's a very old alternator. It's been sitting unused condition for a very long time, maybe 20-30 years, not really sure, but a very long time. And other than that, it looks like that's all it needs, pretty much, is a cleaning. So there's a good chance that if somebody's having difficulties with an alternator, it could be the same problem, just needs a cleaning. That's how it is for this one here anyhow. Doesn't necessarily mean that the diodes are good, so that's why it's important, since it's apart, just to check them. And I'll be back with you if I actually detect something else that was bad. Okay, I'll be back with you. Well, here we have it all cleaned up. Everything ended up being good. So the only problem with this alternator was the contact between the brushes and these slip rings here, the commutator. So it's all cleaned up, nice and polished. The brushes are nice and cleaned up. I even cleaned up all the other things that are down inside there, the diodes and the contacts and all that type of stuff. So that's all the problem ended up being, just really, really, really dirty, and it wasn't able to flow the current like it needed to. So folks, if you have an alternator that's kind of working but not working, it might be the same problem, and realistically all you have to do is take it apart and give it a good cleaning. Now when you do take it apart, when you separate these two halves, it's always smart to give yourself a mark. You can see this scratch here I have right here. That's a scratch, and then the other side here has a scratch on it, and when it goes back together, those two scratches get lined back up, and it gets bolted back together, and then that's it. Now these brushes here, I have to push them in, and you see that hole right here. a piece of wire goes through that hole on the underside of it. Here's the hole here, and that holds the brushes back in their place. So the armature part and the slip rings here will slip past it, and then I pull the wire out, and then the brushes release themselves and rest on top of these here. And before you put it back together, you want to make sure the bearings, there's a bearing down in there in that hole, and then there's a bearing on the other end, which is here. You want to make sure those are free and working and spinning freely and good without any kind of noise or wobbliness to them. And if they do have a wobbliness to them, you want to make sure you change them bearings, or else you're going to have a short life-lived alternator, because one of the bearings is going to blow apart and give you some further grief. So change the bearings, they're not very expensive. And I'll be back with you when I get these two halves mounted back together. Okay, I wanted to show everybody these brushes here. If you look in there very carefully, you can actually see I used a small drill bit to hold the brushes down, and it sticks out the backside just a little wee bit, enough so I can pull it out. So it's all you need is a small wire to go in that holder to hold the brushes down before you put the two halves back together. So I'm going to put the two halves back together, need both hands, and I'll be back with you when it's completed. Well, there we have it, back together. The bolts are back in place, and whatever you do, folks, don't forget to pull out your little piece of wire or your drill bit or whatever you decide to use. In my case, it was a little small tiny drill bit. Don't forget to pull this out or it will not work. Now the only thing left is to put the pulley back on in the fan. That keeps it cool. This is a good time that if you see any of these that are bent, it's a good time to straighten them out. Why they would be bent? Well, sometimes it just happens. Okay, I'm going to get this together, and that's the video for the day. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you have not, and don't forget to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.